It all started with a lie so calculated, so cold-hearted that it shattered everything we once believed about family. Caleb, the so-called golden child, wasn't just content with stealing Logan's fiancée. No, he had to dig deeper into his own greed and desperation. What began as an unthinkable betrayal quickly spiraled into something far darker, a sinister plot fueled by debt, manipulation, and sheer survival instinct. Caleb was drowning in loans from loan sharks who weren't exactly known for their patience or mercy. They'd been calling him at all hours, threatening not only his life but ours if he didn't pay up soon. Desperation turned him into someone I barely recognized anymore. He saw Avery, not as a person, not even as Logan's love, but as a lifeline. Her wealthy family became his target, her trust his weapon. For months, Caleb meticulously worked behind the scenes, planting seeds of doubt in Avery's mind about Logan while painting himself as the better option. It wasn't enough that he betrayed his own brother, it was never enough for Caleb. This wasn't just about jealousy or sibling rivalry, this was survival wrapped in deceit. Every word Caleb whispered to Avery felt like another nail in our family's coffin. And when she finally left Logan, none of us realized the full extent of Caleb's plan until it was too late. The tension at the dinner table had been simmering like a pot on the verge of boiling over, but no one expected it to explode in such a catastrophic way. Caleb sat there with his usual smugness, as if he hadn't just shattered our family into irreparable pieces. Avery sat beside him, her head bowed, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially Riley and me. My mother, Linda, tried to maintain her cheerful facade, insisting we all sit down, eat, and talk. But how could we possibly eat when the air was thick with betrayal? Riley, who had always been the firecracker of the family, couldn't contain herself any longer. When Caleb casually dismissed Logan's pain by saying, "Things just happen," something inside Riley snapped. She leaned forward, her chair screeching against the wooden floor, and slammed her fist onto the table so hard that the plates rattled. "You don't get to act like this is some random coincidence," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "You planned this? You manipulated Avery for months, didn't you? Admit it." Caleb's calm demeanor faltered slightly, but he quickly masked it with his trademark arrogance. "I didn't plan anything," he said coolly, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. "Avery made her choice. End of story." That was the final straw for Riley. With a primal scream, she stood up abruptly, sending her chair clattering backward. Before anyone could react, she grabbed the edge of the dining table and flipped it over with sheer force. Plates, glasses, and food crashed to the floor in a cacophony of destruction. The sound echoed through the room like an explosion, leaving everyone frozen in shock. Caleb stared at Riley, wide-eyed, while Avery let out a small whimper, shrinking further into her seat. Even Linda looked momentarily stunned, her carefully constructed illusion of normalcy crumbling before her eyes. And then, as if fate itself wanted to heighten the chaos, Logan appeared in the doorway. None of us had heard him arrive, but there he was, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his entire body radiating anger. He locked eyes with Caleb, and the hatred in his gaze sent chills down my spine. For a moment, I thought Logan might actually lunge at Caleb right then and there. His fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and his breathing came in ragged bursts. "Logan," Caleb began, his voice uncharacteristically shaky, but Logan cut him off with a venomous glare. "Don't you dare say my name," Logan growled, taking a step closer. The room felt suffocating, the weight of years of resentment pressing down on all of us. Riley moved instinctively between them, her hands raised as if to shield Logan from Caleb, or perhaps to stop him from doing something he'd regret. "You've done enough damage," Riley spat at Caleb, her voice raw with emotion. "Look what you've done to this family." To Logan. Caleb opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For once, he seemed lost, unable to conjure up one of his usual excuses. Meanwhile, Avery finally broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. It was clear she realized too late the monster she had aligned herself with. Logan took another step toward Caleb, his jaw clenched, and for a terrifying second, I thought fists would fly. But instead, Logan stopped, his chest heaving as he fought to regain control. "This isn't over," Logan said in a low, menacing tone before storming out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Linda had always been Caleb's shield, deflecting every storm that threatened to expose his flaws. But this time, her protection wasn't just about blind maternal love, it was deliberate, calculated, and suffocating for the rest of us. As we sat in her living room after yet another explosive confrontation with Caleb, I couldn't help but notice how she clung to her usual defense mechanisms. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice strained as Riley accused her of enabling Caleb's manipulative behavior. Linda's eyes darted between us, searching for any crack in our resolve, but there was none left to find. It wasn't until later that night, while lying awake in bed, that memories I'd buried long ago resurfaced, memories of Linda stepping in to clean up Caleb's messes, no matter the cost. One particular incident stood out vividly. When Caleb was in college, he'd been caught plagiarizing a major paper. Instead of letting him face the consequences, Linda had called the professor, spinning some elaborate lie about how Caleb had been under immense stress due to family issues. She even hinted at financial troubles on our part, guilt-tripping the professor into giving him a second chance. At the time, I thought it was just a mother protecting her child. Now, I realized it was the beginning of something far more toxic, a pattern of shielding Caleb from accountability that only fueled his arrogance. Over the years, these interventions became more frequent and egregious. When Caleb lost his first job because of unethical practices, Linda didn't hesitate to pull strings through an old friend to get him rehired elsewhere. Each time, she justified it as helping him get back on track, but what she really did was teach him that he could do anything without facing repercussions. And now, here we were, staring at the wreckage of our family because of it. The realization hit me like a freight train. Linda knew exactly what Caleb was capable of. Even now, as she dismissed Avery's confession about Caleb's manipulation, I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She knew he was lying, yet she chose to side with him anyway. Her loyalty wasn't born out of ignorance, it was willful blindness, a refusal to see the monster she had created. For the first time, I felt anger toward my own mother, not just Caleb. How many times had she sacrificed our trust for his sake? How many lies had she told to keep the illusion of her golden child intact? As I replayed those moments in my mind, I understood why Caleb believed he was untouchable. With Linda as his enabler, he never had to grow up, never had to take responsibility. But this time, we weren't going to let her protect him. Enough was enough. Avery's world had become a suffocating labyrinth, with Caleb on one side and Logan's family on the other. She sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline, but every call felt like stepping deeper into quicksand. The truth Caleb had revealed to Mason, that he'd used her for her family's wealth, had shattered whatever fragile trust she still held in him. But now, trapped between his veiled threats, "You wouldn't want this to get messy, would you?" and the icy silence from Logan's siblings, Avery felt more isolated than ever. Desperation clawed at her chest as she scrolled through her contacts, landing on Logan's name. Her thumb hovered over the call button, trembling. What could she even say? "I'm sorry I ruined your life, but I didn't mean to." Yet, something inside her screamed that Logan deserved to hear the truth, not from Caleb or Riley, but from her. Summoning what little courage she had left, she pressed the call button. Logan answered after the third ring, his voice flat and distant. "What do you want, Avery?" It wasn't angry, just empty. That emptiness cut deeper than any accusation could have. I need to explain," she stammered, tears already spilling down her cheeks. "Caleb, he manipulated me. I didn't know what he was doing until it was too late. Please, Logan, believe me." There was a long pause, so heavy it felt like the air itself might collapse. When Logan finally spoke, his words were sharp, cutting through her like shards of glass. "Save it, Avery. You made your choice. Don't drag me into your guilt trip." And then, without another word, he hung up. The dial tone buzzed in her ear, mocking her. Avery dropped the phone onto the floor, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. Caleb's smug smile flashed in her mind, followed by Logan's hollow gaze. Both men had reduced her to nothing, a pawn in their twisted game. For the first time, Avery realized she wasn't just fighting for redemption, she was fighting to survive. After the family's final confrontation, Caleb's world unraveled faster than anyone could have imagined. The once untouchable golden child was now a man drowning in consequences he couldn't escape. It started with small signs, missed calls from unknown numbers, letters arriving in plain white envelopes that he'd toss aside without opening, but soon escalated into something far more sinister. One evening, as Caleb sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, there was a sharp knock at the door. He froze, his heart pounding like a war drum. When he opened it, two men stood on the threshold, their faces hard and unreadable. "You've been avoiding us," one of them growled, stepping inside without invitation. They didn't raise their voices, but their threats were clear: pay up or they'd make sure his family paid the price. The weight of his choices crushed him overnight. Without Linda's protection or the family's support, Caleb had nowhere to turn. His carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the hollow shell beneath. Days turned into weeks, and Caleb began to physically deteriorate. Gone was the polished, confident man who once strutted through life as if the world owed him everything. Now, he wandered aimlessly through rain-soaked streets, his clothes disheveled, his hair matted, and dark circles etched under his eyes like bruises. Strangers glanced at him with pity, or worse, disdain, as he shuffled past storefronts, muttering to himself. One particularly cold night, I spotted him near the old diner where we used to gather as kids. At first, I almost didn't recognize him. His tailored suits were replaced by a stained jacket that hung loosely off his gaunt frame. He looked up briefly when he heard footsteps, but recognition barely flickered in his hollow eyes before he returned to staring blankly at the cracked pavement. This wasn't Caleb anymore. This was a ghost of who he used to be, a tragic figure consumed by guilt, desperation, and the wreckage of his own making. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, but then I remembered Logan's shattered trust, Avery's tears, and Riley's fury. Whatever happened to Caleb now, he brought it upon himself. It was a cold, gray afternoon when Logan stumbled upon Avery at the local coffee shop, a place they used to frequent together during happier times. He froze in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat as their eyes met across the crowded room. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Avery stood there, her hands trembling around the cup of tea she had been holding, tears already pooling in her wide, guilt-ridden eyes. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than he remembered, like the weight of her choices had physically crushed her. Avery, Logan murmured under his breath, though it wasn't clear if he meant for her to hear him or if it was just an involuntary reaction. Her name hung heavy in the air between them, a ghost of everything they once were. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Avery took a step forward, then another, until she was standing directly in front of him. Her voice cracked as she spoke, barely above a whisper. "Logan, please, I'm so sorry." The words hit him like shards of glass, sharp and unrelenting. Sorry? What could she possibly say to undo the damage that had been done? To erase the betrayal, the lies, the way Caleb had manipulated both of them into this nightmare. Logan wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead, he found himself frozen, unable to move or speak. His silence only fueled Avery's desperation. Tears streamed down her face now, unchecked and raw, as she reached out toward him, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. "Please forgive me," she begged, her voice breaking with every syllable. "I didn't know what Caleb was doing, not at first. And by the time I realized, it was too late. But I never meant to hurt you, Logan. You have to believe me." For a fleeting second, Logan's resolve wavered. There was something undeniably sincere in her plea, something that tugged at the edges of his heart. But then he remembered the countless nights he'd spent staring at the ceiling, replaying their relationship in his mind, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. He thought about Caleb's smug smile, Avery's hand in his brother's grasp, and the shattered remains of the life he'd built. All of it came rushing back, drowning out any trace of compassion he might have felt. Without a word, Logan pulled his arm away from her touch. His jaw tightened as he turned his back on her, leaving her standing alone amidst the bustling crowd. As he walked away, he heard her sobbing behind him, each cry echoing like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. But he didn't look back. He couldn't. Forgiveness wasn't something he could give, not now, maybe not ever. The final chapter of Caleb's downfall came on a cold, gray morning that seemed to mirror the bleakness of his fate. The authorities arrived at our family home just as the sun was rising, their presence casting long shadows across the driveway. I watched from the window as two officers stepped out of their car, their faces stern and purposeful. My heart pounded in my chest, not out of fear for Caleb, but because I knew this moment had been inevitable. After months of evading his debts and manipulating those around him, Caleb's web of lies had finally unraveled. He was being arrested for financial fraud, a crime he thought he could escape by using Avery's family connections. But karma, it seemed, wasn't so easily fooled. When the doorbell rang, Linda answered it with trembling hands. Her face went pale as she took in the sight of the officers standing there. "Is there a Caleb here?" one of them asked, his voice firm and unyielding. For once, Linda didn't try to shield him or make excuses. She simply nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and gestured toward the living room where Caleb sat slumped on the couch. As the officers approached him, Caleb looked up, his eyes wide with panic. "Wait," he stammered, holding up a hand as if to stop them. "You don't understand, I can fix this." But they weren't interested in his empty promises. They cuffed him quickly, reciting his rights in a monotone voice that left no room for negotiation. As they led him out of the house, his head hung low, shame written all over his face. We stood in silence, Linda, Riley, Logan, and I, as we watched him pass. His golden boy persona was gone, replaced by the hollow shell of a man who had burned every bridge he ever crossed. Linda's eyes followed him, filled with sorrow but devoid of the blind loyalty she once held. For the first time, she saw Caleb not as her perfect son, but as the broken, selfish individual he truly was. Riley crossed her arms, her expression unreadable, while Logan stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. As Caleb was pushed into the back seat of the police car, he glanced back at us through the window. There was desperation in his gaze, a silent plea for forgiveness, or perhaps salvation, but none of us moved. None of us spoke. The golden child, who had once ruled our lives, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. And as the car drove away, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. This wasn't just Caleb's punishment, it was justice for everything he had taken from us. While clearing out Caleb's old room in the aftermath of his arrest, we stumbled upon something that felt like a bombshell waiting to explode. Buried beneath layers of dusty textbooks and forgotten memorabilia was an old journal, its pages brittle with age. My stomach churned as I flipped through it. Every entry revealed a side of Caleb none of us had fully understood. Logan got picked for the science fair again, one passage read. Of course he did. Mom barely noticed me today. If I can't be better than him, maybe I can make sure he doesn't shine so brightly. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just jealousy, this was calculated sabotage. As we dug deeper, we found scribbled notes about other instances where Caleb had meddled in Logan's life. He'd tampered with Logan's soccer gear before a big game, ensuring he'd miss practice. He even admitted to spreading rumors about Logan during middle school, ruining his chances at being class president. Each revelation painted a chilling picture of a brother who didn't just resent Logan, he actively worked to destroy his opportunities. Riley gasped when she saw the entries, her hands trembling as she held the journal. All these years, he's been tearing Logan down while pretending to care. Her voice cracked under the weight of betrayal. Even Linda, who had always defended Caleb, stood frozen, her face pale. For the first time, there was no excuse, no justification. The truth was undeniable. Caleb's envy had poisoned our family long before Avery came into the picture. It wasn't just about stealing Logan's fiancée, it was the culmination of decades of resentment and manipulation. The stress of the family's unraveling finally caught up with Linda in a way none of us expected. One evening, Riley called me in a panic, her voice trembling as she said, "Mom collapsed. They've taken her to the hospital." My heart sank as I rushed to meet her there. The doctors explained that it was a severe stroke brought on by prolonged stress and exhaustion, something we all knew had been building for months. But what made this moment unbearable wasn't just Linda's condition, it was the question hanging over our heads like a storm cloud: should we let Caleb see her? Caleb hadn't contacted any of us since our confrontation at the house, but now, faced with the possibility of losing our mother, old wounds resurfaced with brutal clarity. Logan sat silently in the waiting room, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. Riley paced back and forth, muttering under her breath about how unfair it was to even consider letting him near her. "He doesn't deserve to be here," she snapped when I suggested maybe he deserved closure. "After everything he's done? No way." But guilt gnawed at me. Despite everything, Caleb was still our brother, and Linda was his mother too. If she didn't pull through, would I regret not giving him a chance to say goodbye? Yet every time I imagined him walking into the hospital room, my blood boiled. He'd manipulated Avery, betrayed Logan, and torn our family apart, all while Linda shielded him until the very end. Did he really deserve forgiveness? When the nurse informed us that Linda might only have hours left, the weight of the decision crushed us. Logan finally spoke, his voice hollow but firm. "If we let him come, it's not for him. It's for Mom." Riley hesitated, tears streaming down her face, before nodding reluctantly. We sent word to Caleb, unsure if he'd even show up. When he arrived, his usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a haunted look that mirrored the pain we all felt. For the first time, I saw vulnerability in him, but whether it was genuine or another act, I couldn't tell. In the end, it wasn't just Caleb who fell apart, it was everything we had blindly clung to for years. The illusion of perfection, the belief that family bonds could never break, crumbled alongside him. But from the wreckage emerged something unexpected: clarity. We realized that sometimes, destruction is necessary before rebuilding can begin. For too long, we had lived under Caleb's shadow, a man so consumed by his own selfishness that he left none of us untouched by his chaos. His betrayal didn't just shatter Logan's trust or ruin Avery's life, it exposed the cracks in our foundation, forcing us to confront truths we'd buried deep. Linda, once unwavering in her defense of Caleb, finally admitted she couldn't fix this. "Maybe some things aren't meant to be fixed," she whispered one evening, her voice heavy with regret. It was a painful admission, but also liberating. Without Caleb's toxic influence looming over us, we began to heal, not as individuals tied together by obligation, but as a family choosing to rebuild on honesty and forgiveness. Logan started seeing someone new, someone kind who appreciated him for who he truly was. Riley threw herself into her passions, rediscovering joy outside of anger. And me? I learned that strength lies not in holding on, but in letting go. Caleb may have been the storm that tore us apart, but he also taught us how to stand stronger without him.